It's really my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the day, Jeremy Narby, anthropologist and writer. Jeremy grew up in Canada and Switzerland, studied history at the University of Canterbury, and received a doctorate in anthropology from Stanford University. He spent several years living with the Shamanic people in the Peruvian Amazon, cataloging indigenous uses of rainforest resources to help combat ecological destruction. He has sponsored an expedition to the rainforest for biologists and other scientists to examine indigenous knowledge systems and the utility of ayahuasca in gaining knowledge. Since 1989, Jeremy has been working as the Amazonian Projects Director for the Swiss NGO Nouvelle Planète. He is the author of several books, including The Cosmic Serpent, DNA and the Origins of Knowledge, Shamans Over Time, 500 Years on the Path to Knowledge, which was edited by Narby and Francis Huxley, Intelligence in Nature, 2005, and Psychotropic Mind, The World According to Ayahuasca, Iboga, and Shamanism in 2010. So this morning, please join me in welcoming Jeremy Narby. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bill. Howdy. Here we go. Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm an anthropologist. This means that I study people. In 1984, I strolled into the Peruvian Amazon, fresh from the suburbs and the library. I had no previous experience of the tropical forest or its indigenous inhabitants. And back in those days, development experts said that to develop the Amazon, you had to rid the forest of its indigenous inhabitants and cut down the trees to exploit its resources. They said Indians don't know how to use their resources rationally, and confiscating their territories is economically justified. Well, as a young anthropologist, I wanted to live with Shamanic Indians right in the middle of the Peruvian Amazon and study how they used the rainforest to try to show that they used their resources rationally and therefore deserved the right to own their lands. The point was to contradict the international development banks and try to bring about a change of policy. The Ashaninka people that I started living with took me under their wing and showed me what they knew about the forest. Well, it turns out that the Peruvian Amazon is the epicenter of world biodiversity. There are more species of trees, insects, reptiles, amphibians, birds, mammals than in any other place of similar size. When you walk into this forest, it's a blur of species. Scientists have found more species of ants on a single tree than in all the British Isles, more species of birds in a single valley than in all of North America, more species of trees on a couple of acres than in all of Europe. It's the place in the world where life is most fertile and active, and you can smell it. When you walk into the forest, there's a musky, funky smell like in a greenhouse. Well, oddly, these barefoot Indians who would accompany me into the forest had names in their language for just about every species of plant and ascribed uses to about half of them. They used plants as building materials, cosmetics, dyes, foods, medicines. They had plants that could heal chronic backache, cure diarrhea, accelerate the healing of wounds, they said. Well, I was trained in the school of rationalism, and when people say we have something that can cure chronic backache, well, let's check it out. I'd played too much tennis when I was young and had chronic backache. So this plant is called Chiricsanango, fever tree, and they said this will chill you to the bone and turn you into rubber for 48 hours and show you a few images, and then on the third day you'll be healed. So, okay. And that's exactly how it happened. I took a half cup of this stuff, not thinking it was going to work, just thinking it would be interesting for the research I was conducting. But it turned out that, yes, I lost all muscular coordination for 2 days, was chilled to the bone for about 6 hours. It felt like a bad trip. I did see a few images for about 5 minutes. And on the morning of the third day, I regained my muscular coordination, and hey presto, the deep tension in my lower left back was gone. And to this day, it has not returned. And it could not have been psychosomatic, because I didn't think it was going to work. Well, this is just one of those anecdotes, so I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything, but it's true that several experiences like that led me to start asking my Ashanika consultants how they knew what they knew about plants. And their answer was enigmatic. They said, knowledge about plants comes from the plants themselves, and that ayahuasqueros or tabaqueros or shamans take ayahuasca, which is a hallucinogenic plant mixture, or eat tobacco concentrate, and speak with the essences or mothers or spirits, which are common to all life forms and are sources of information. They said, nature speaks to people in visions and in dreams. Well, I didn't take seriously what these Indians were telling me. It couldn't be true. Because to consider that there's verifiable information in your hallucinations is the definition of psychosis. It was an epistemological impossibility. And besides, it contradicted the main aim of my research, which was to show that these people use their resources rationally. But after several months in this village, I found myself in a neighboring village one night, drinking manioc beer with some men. You know, that's how you do research. You hang out with the natives, work with them, and end up finally drinking beer with them and chatting, and asking them about the origin of their knowledge about plants. And one man said, Hermano Jeremias, Brother Jeremy, if you want to know the answer to your question, you have to drink ayahuasca. And if you like, I can show you sometime. He said it was the television of the forest. And that it can show you images and you can learn things. Kind of like an educational TV channel. Well, I happen to have grown up in Switzerland, where LSD is an indigenous product, and I had tried it several times, so I thought I knew about this kind of thing. And so I accepted his proposition, and several nights later found myself on the platform of a quiet house with this ayahuasquero and 2 other people, surrounded by the sounds of the forest at night. And I'll tell you about this experience. I'll preface it by saying that by giving this testimony, I'm not seeking to encourage anybody to take hallucinogenic substances. It's, I think, a risky thing to do, even if you are. It's just taking a plant or a plant mixture. You can't know until you've taken it just how borderline you might be. These are not substances for people who are psychologically delicate. But nevertheless, I decided to accept the proposition because I was curious, but also in the name of anthropology. What wouldn't one do? Well, ayahuasca is an extremely bitter liquid. So I ingested it, and we were just sitting on the platform of the house and in the dark. And after several minutes of silence, the ayahuasquero started singing these barely audible, slightly dissonant loops of melodies. And I found myself inundated by all kinds of images, and suddenly found myself surrounded by enormous fluorescent serpents that were 15 yards long, 1 yard high, terrifyingly real, colors 10 to 100 times more intense than ordinary reality. And these entities started communicating to me in a kind of telepathic language that went right through my forehead, things that were painfully true about myself. And the first thing that they said was, "You are just a tiny human being." And I could see, looking at them, that they were right, and that my ordinary perspective on reality, rationalist, materialist, humanist, had limits, starting with my presupposition that what my eyes were showing me didn't exist. I could see that my worldview had bottomless arrogance, which caused it to collapse in front of my eyes, at which point I had to vomit. In Ashaninka, the word for ayahuasca is kamarampi, from the verb kamarank, to vomit. And it also contains the word maranki, which is serpent. So the word for the plant brew that gives knowledge is vomit serpent. I stepped over these serpents, say, "Excuse me," and ended up next to a tree a few yards away from the house, started vomiting colors. I could see in the dark. I could see an Ashaninka woman levitating above the ground about 7 yards away. You know, this is another kind of level of reality, completely discombobulating. When I'd finished my ablutions, and to cut a long story short, I returned to the circle where the shaman was singing his songs and sat back down, and the experience I had was of blasting out of my body, miles above the planet. The planet was all white and covered in ice. This was 1985, 8 years before a scientist formulated the hypothesis of snowball Earth. I'd never even heard of this idea. And then the shaman changed his melody, and I landed back down in my body and started seeing hundreds of thousands of intricate images, like the veins of a human hand and the veins of a green leaf flashing back and they looked the same. Hundreds of thousands of images, impossible to remember them all. The overall experience was like being in a washing machine for 3 hours. A washing machine. Okay. Well, I slept soundly, and then the next morning decided to freshen up a little bit. Went down to the river and picked up a leaf of a bush and held it up to the sun and compared it to the skin on my hand and could see that it was literally true. Felt the same, looked the same. I'd never really thought of this the overall experience was a kind of reconciliation with nature. I may be just a little human being, but somehow part of nature. I was like a plant, but I could actually walk around. Not bad. So the experience confirmed what my Shamanic consultants had said. You can take ayahuasca with a trained practitioner and learn things. I had learned that I was puny, but somehow part of nature. This was just what a young anthropologist needed to learn. It was an antidote to the anthropocentrism of anthropology, which is not nothing. But at the same time, it was too much. How could I return to my university and hope to have my colleagues and professors take me seriously? The shadow of Carlos Castaneda flew over my budding career, and I chickened out and continued doing my research on the rational uses that the Shamanic made of their resources for another 15 months. Well, and during these months, I had a series of surprising experiences that flew in the face of my understanding of reality. I'll just tell you one of them. One day I was with my main Shamanic consultant, who was a tobacco shaman, or tabaquero, or cheripiari in their language. And we went and visited his old teacher. And when we got up to the place where this old man was living, he was sitting there on a mat in his cotton gown and eating tobacco paste from a stick that fit into a gourd. And this guy was at least 80 years old. He was all wrinkly, but in fact he was so old that he didn't know his age because he was born before the Shamanic started counting. And when I was introduced to him, the old man looked at me with a glint in his eye and asked me whether I was his father-in-law. And, well, at the time, I wasn't even a third his age, so I knew that this was a joke. And I decided to play along with him and said, yes. And he laughed, and then he asked me again, Konki, father-in-law? And once again, I said yes. And then we went back and forth like this about 20 times. And each time I answered yes, his laugh got a little bit longer. Well, I learned later that evening from my consultant that the question also meant, may I have sexual access to your daughters? So the joke was on me. But I decided to put an end to our exchange by asking him whether I could try his tobacco paste. So he handed me his gourd, and I put a stickful between my lips, and then sat to the side and allowed the gentlemen to get on with their business. And for a few minutes just sat there thinking about nothing much. You know, this is anthropological field work. You often end up sitting around not really understanding what's going on and staring out into space. And suddenly I started running my tongue under my front teeth, and they seemed to be strangely long and sharp. And I had this kind of taste of blood in my mouth. And though I was a vegetarian at the time, it tasted good. And then I could feel, I hadn't shaved for a few days, but I could feel that I had these kind of like whiskers that were coming out of my face and seemed to give me an enhanced perception of my environment. And my body was telling me that I was partially going into a feline mode. And I had this feline feeling, a kind of a warm, powerful and wise feeling. And I started eyeing these chickens that were clucking around and decided not to pounce on them. And, well, because you know the tobacco paste is strong when the anthropologist starts attacking the chickens. This is the kind of experience that completely flew in the face of what I thought was even possible. But that feline feeling stays with me to this day. And by consuming that tobacco paste, I have a kind of intuitive feeling of just what it might be to be a wild cat. But it took years to just even start thinking about that kind of experience, and years to be able to get up in front of a bunch of Westerners and talk about it. Because, and I think that understanding Amazonian approaches to knowledge can take a lot of time. Well, after 2 years of this field work, I returned to my university and wrote a dissertation in which ayahuasca and tobacco and these questions are hardly mentioned, and focusing on the rational use of resources by Ashaninka people, and then became a doctor in anthropology. Well, the Ashaninka people taught me a lot of things, and some of which took years to become clear. But one idea that was they got through to me very quickly was this notion that practice is the most advanced form of theory. In their view, if an idea is good, you can do something with it. Otherwise, it's just pura teoria, pure theory, and not much good. So I wanted to apply what I had learned and started working for a Swiss NGO to help indigenous Amazonian people gain titles to their lands and, well, to propose initiatives that they felt were important for their survival as people and as cultures. So land titling, bilingual education, productive activities like fish farming. And this work that I've been doing for the last 22 years now allowed me to return to the Western Amazon, in particular the Peruvian Amazon, on a regular basis, and to visit not just Ashaninka people, but Aguaruna, Witoto, Bora, Matsigenka, Shawi, dozens of different societies speaking different languages. And during these trips, I would ask these different people my hobby question. Well, how do you know what you know about plants? And they would roughly give the same answer, even though they lived hundreds of miles apart. They would say, our ayahuasqueros, tabaqueros take their plant mixtures and speak in their visions with the essences that are common to all life forms, and that's how they learn. You got it? Yeah, I got it. But what's it mean? So this was a mystery. Here are people living in the most biologically diverse place on Earth in intimate fashion for thousands of years. Their knowledge about plants is now widely recognized by science and industry. And they say that a good part of their knowledge comes from the hallucinations of their shamans. What could this mean? In 1992, I went to Rio, the Earth Summit in Rio, and at this point, it seemed that everybody was talking about the ecological knowledge of indigenous people, in particular indigenous Amazonian people, but nobody was talking about the hallucinatory origin of this knowledge as the indigenous people themselves talked about it. So I decided to look into this question. And, I have nothing against reductionism. In fact, I reduced the whole field of inquiry down to that one question. What does this mean? Well, I spent months looking into shamanism, reading the literature, and I began to see a coherence, not just in the Western Amazon, but in shamanic traditions around the world. Everywhere where there are shamans, these people work with trance states and claim to enter into communication with what anthropologists call spirits, which give them their knowledge, and which historians of religion say they associate with a shape called the axis mundi, the axis of the world, shaped like two entwined vines or serpents or a twisted ladder, spiral staircase. And this entity, which is shows up in shamanic traditions around the world, is an entity along which the spirits that shamans communicate with go up and down. And this axis of the world is purported to be extremely long, so long that it can link earth and heaven. Okay, well, after 6 months of research into this, I could see that this is what the literature said, but didn't really make it any more understandable. And the mystery was only deepening. And I decided, because I couldn't really see what the answer might be, I decided just to start playing around with ideas. And the idea was, well, maybe there is a concept in rational science that might correspond to this. So what could it be? These people are saying that there are essences that are common to all life forms and that they associate with this twisted ladder shape. What could be an equivalent concept in science? Well, funny, I began to see correspondences between what these shamans were talking about and DNA, the molecule that is indeed present in every cell of every living being and that is shaped precisely like a twisted ladder. And this shape explains its function. It's because the DNA double helix is shaped like two complementary strands wrapped around each other that it can be unwound and have exact copies of itself made. This shape allows it to be an information storage and duplication device. And the DNA in a human cell is 10 atoms wide and 2 meters long. That's 1 billion times longer than its own width. And if you could, that's equivalent to a little finger that stretches from Paris to Los Angeles. And if you could line up all the DNA threads in a human body, it would stretch approximately 120 billion miles, which is enough to wrap around the Earth 5 million times, or to go back and forth between Saturn and the Sun 70 times inside a single human body. And DNA is not just a chemical, not just a deoxyribonucleic acid. It's also a kind of text, and biologists have sequenced it as such. Saying that DNA is just a chemical is like saying that the works of Shakespeare are just ink on paper. It's a true statement, but it doesn't say much. And DNA communicates its information to the rest of the cell through a coding system that is strikingly similar to the codes used by human beings, in that the individual signs have no meaning. The 4 molecules that make up the rungs of the DNA ladder, to which scientists have ascribed the letters A, G, C, and T, have no meaning individually. They have to be combined by 3s for meaning to emerge. The genetic code has 64 3-letter words, all of which have meaning, including several punctuation marks. Start and stop, Well, until the discovery of the genetic code in the 1960s, it was thought that this kind of coding system, where the individual signs have no meaning, was the proof of intelligence. And because only human beings, it was thought, used such codes. But it turns out that every single cell in the world uses this coding system, and that there is an underlying symbolic unity in all of nature. Well, it's not getting any simpler, right? I could see that there were, at this point, there seemed to be two valid ways of knowing: the scientific, rational, materialist, molecular approach. But then there was this completely different way of going about it that led to similar conclusions. And that, like reverse camera angles, one could look at plants, animals, life on Earth, and how it works from a scientific perspective. And then one could look at exactly the same question, but from a shamanic perspective. And that one could go back and forth like this. And I started doing this in my own mind. And what I could see was intelligence in nature. Well, as shamans had long said that their plants and animals are intelligent beings, recent scientific research on the question was confirming this, even with the simplest organisms. There was new evidence that ants can cultivate mushroom gardens, bees can handle abstract concepts, crows can make standardized tools with hooks, dolphins can recognize themselves in mirrors, and parrots can say what they mean. Even plants aren't stupid. The molecular genetics of the last 2 decades has revealed the signals and receptors that plant cells use as they communicate and learn. Plants can integrate information and respond on the whole plant level. And to do this, they use electrical and chemical signals, some of which are identical to the ones that our own neurons use. Plants don't have brains so much as act like them. Well, this has been a long path. It's true that after studying Amazonian Indians and shamans, I decided that it would be interesting to do an anthropology of science and to start studying scientists. And what's so funny? I'm going into labs, talking with scientists with the same respect that I talk to indigenous shamans. I mean, not so much talking as listening, seeing how they go about things. And, there's all kinds of fascinating and pertinent research going on. And, there are scientists who are looking into plant intelligence now. Well, we know that 20 or 30 years ago, you would have been considered crazy to call plants intelligent, but now it's a serious field of research. And researchers have found, for example, what does it mean that a plant is intelligent? Well, take the parasitic plant dodder, for example. Dodder moves around by wrapping itself around other plants and then estimating their nutritional quality. And then it decides whether to eat or whether to move on. Well, it turns out that Dodder's foraging strategies have the same mathematical correctness as those of animal foragers, but Dodder does this without the benefit of a brain. Should I stay or should I go? The clash. Well, so plant intelligence. What does the word mean, intelligence? It comes from Latin, interlegere, to choose between, and implies the capacity to make decisions. Well, if you look in dictionaries, you'll find that intelligence has been defined in many ways over the years, often in exclusively human terms. And so, by definition, it cannot apply to other species. So there's a kind of conceptual void or problem there. And this was made most clear to me when I went to Japan to interview Toshiyuki Nakagaki, who is the researcher who showed that single-celled slime molds can solve a maze. I'll just tell you briefly about these slime molds. They are peculiar creatures. They're single cells that can grow to the size of a human hand. They behave like a glistening mass of mucus that swarms over and engulfs its food. Hardly a prime candidate for intellectual achievement. They put pieces of this slime in a miniature maze, and the slime can, if it's cut up, it can rejoin and form one giant cell. And the slime initially spreads out and fills all the corridors of the maze. But when the researchers put food in the form of oatmeal at the entrance and the exit of the maze, the slime withdrew from the dead ends and shrank its body down to form a tube spanning the shortest distance between the food sources, thereby solving the maze. Just how this blob-like organism computes the shortest path between the entrance and the exit of the maze is not known, but that it does so is now established experimentally. Well, Toshiyuki Nakagaki and his colleagues published their results in the journal Nature, and they used the word intelligence to refer to the slime mold's behavior. He told me that there had been two kinds of reactions to this work. Western researchers and journalists mainly questioned whether the word intelligence was appropriate to describe what the slime mold did, whereas Japanese observers mainly wanted to know how the organism had done what it had done. Nakagaki ascribed this difference to the animist background of Japanese culture and to the Japanese word for intelligence, which is chi-sei. Chi means to know, and sei is the capacity of. So chi-sei is a capacity to know. Japanese people do not hesitate to attribute a capacity to know to all manner of organisms, including single-celled slime. Well, I asked him how he had dealt with the dilemma of the Western observers. And he said that he had subsequently noticed that when he used the word smartness as opposed to intelligence, Westerners agreed. And so from then on, he only used the word smartness, which is pretty smart. But the only problem is that the first meaning of the word smart is elegant, tidy, and clean, and has little pertinence to intelligence in nature. Nature itself is a tricky concept. Dictionaries define it as the phenomena of the physical world to the exclusion of humans and human creations. It's everything except ourselves, in other words. Funny thing is that when you go deep into nature, into the Amazonian forest, and speak with these people who live in nature, and you say, what is your word for everything except humans? They say, what? you say, everything else except us. They say, well, no, we don't have a word like that. On the contrary, we think that everybody else is human and that our eyes mislead us. But when you take ayahuasca and tobacco, you see through this illusion and you see the human, the person inside all these other beings, which are beings and not objects. And there it is. So nature as a concept implies a disengagement from the world. It implies a barrier between humans and all the rest. It's a typical Western concept. It's based on a dichotomy. We dichotomize without even realizing it. Nature is defined in opposition to culture and vice versa. Well, as you can see, I think that it's important to be careful with every word that one uses. And and especially if one is going back and forth between systems of knowledge, because words carry baggage with them, and if one uses them carelessly, then one can project the baggage onto what one is studying without even realizing it. If one is strict with words, intelligence in nature is a contradiction in terms, because intelligence excludes non-humans and nature excludes humans. But this mainly shows us that our concepts that disengage us from other species hamper our thinking. We struggle with words when the slime mold solves the maze because our concepts don't fit the data. It is not that nature lacks intelligence, but that our own concepts do. Are you with me? Or? Okay. Well, so where does this leave us? Yeah, I think that it's important to be aware of the presuppositions of one's own culture. For example, what the Japanese researchers putting slime in a maze. I mean, who would even have thought of it? Well, because they come from a different cultural background, they ask questions that we wouldn't have thought of asking. So each and every observer, be it an American scientist, Swiss scientist, Japanese scientist, Amazonian shaman, looks at the world through the lens of his or her own culture, and becoming aware of how one's culture influences one helps one gain a better understanding of what one is seeing. So that's one point. I think, you all laughed before when I was saying that I was studying scientists like I was studying shamans. And, that's okay. But really, I do think that we all are people. We are all Homo sapiens sapiens. Science is a wonderful thing. It's established a lot of the data that I've been talking about here. I'm not saying that we've got to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think science is a wonderful thing, but it does not have a monopoly on knowledge. Up until now, it's had a nasty tendency to disqualify anything that went about understanding the world in a different way. But I think that there's now sufficient indications to say that there's enough room for several ways of knowing, and that it is like a reverse camera angle. And if you have another perspective, you gain more knowledge. And so what I thought would be interesting to do in a kind of a hybrid approach to research was to propose that it might be possible to gain molecular information from visions orchestrated by an indigenous ayahuasca shaman. This was the hypothesis that I presented in my book, The Cosmic Serpent, DNA and the Origins of Knowledge. Well, so over the last 15 years, I've been fishing for scientists who are willing to submit to this experience, and so far have accompanied three molecular biologists and one medical researcher down to the Amazon to go through with this experience. And I can tell you briefly about it. I've published a description of the first jaunt of this kind in the book Shamans Through Time. So if you want to find out the details of just what questions they were asking and what answers they came up with, you can check it out. It's not easy to combine these different approaches, and there are enormous methodological differences between the two approaches, and that just makes it more interesting in my view. I think the first thing to point out is that when one practices science, one aims for an objective position, and one therefore tries to jettison subjectivity. Well, ayahuasca works the other way around. It's first and foremost a subjective experience. And so if you take a lab director who's spent 30 years trying to jettison her subjectivity and take them down to an ayahuasca shaman and administer the bitter brew, the first thing that happens is that they have all kinds of work to do on themselves before they can even get to the information that they would want. The French researcher who went down with me said that he felt that ayahuasca was certainly a path to knowledge, but that it was a hard path and that it was no shortcut to the Nobel Prize, unfortunately. Yes, it does simply take time. The most recent research of this kind that I've been accompanying and have not published yet involves a leading tuberculosis researcher who has his lab in Chicago and the Institute for Tuberculosis Research. And by going down to Peru and having conversations with an indigenous shaman, it turns out that there's nothing funny about it whatsoever. These two, once you get the scientific researcher and the shaman who knows about plants talking, in fact, they're like colleagues. They're both interested in finding remedies for people who are ill. It's as simple as that. And that by getting conversations of this kind going, one comes up with new ideas, new hypotheses, plants that can be tested, but it takes time. And this is, I would love to be able to rush out here and give all kinds of results and say we've come up with all kinds of remedies already. Actually, it's ongoing research and it's slow, and fitting the rigors of American university labs and bioterrorism acts and forms to fill, together with indigenous Amazonian plant knowledge, it's a difficult fit. So it takes time, but it's ongoing research. And my conclusion about all this is, pretty obvious, is that more research is needed. But and I'm sure that everybody can conclude the same thing about their field of study. In this particular case, bringing together these radically different systems of knowledge, for me, shows that there's also a need to develop a common ground for human knowledge, which allows different systems of knowledge to be compared and used together. Now, a common ground for human knowledge would reconcile oral expertise and scientific texts, emotion and detachment, microscopes and modified consciousness, and bringing together different ways of knowing like this. I call this bi-cognitivism. And I think bi-cognitivism is like bilingualism. In other words, it's difficult, but it's worth it because it gives you another way of looking at the world. More tools, more concepts with which to make sense of what we see. So if you have any questions, I'd be pleased to field them.
Now, you mentioned the Amazon. Thank you. And you mentioned all these drugs or plants that produce all sorts of disorders or enhancement of thought. What about cocaine? That began there. What's your concept of the anthropology of cocaine in Peru, or as used by the primitive cultures of Peru, and the anthropology of cocaine in our culture in the United States, for instance?
Yeah, well, Wade Davis is going to be talking later, and he can certainly talk about that. But he and I were talking a couple of weeks ago, and I subscribe entirely to his point of view, which is Coca is just a fantastic plant. It's nutritionally very rich. The experience of chewing coca leaves is, I find, a wonderful experience. But cocaine is one of the nastiest drugs, and the cocaine economy kills Indians, poisons rainforests. Every time you snort a line, you're destroying rainforest. It's one of the ugliest drugs around. And well, it's happened time and time again that the Western technological world has taken indigenous shamanic plants and turned them into substances of abuse. So, coca leaves, yes. Cocaine, no.
The next question is coming from your right.
What did you run into in terms of music, play, and dance, maybe in the Amazon people?
Well, music is absolutely central to the ayahuasca experience, and I think that the way that they look at it is that these essences that are common to all life forms and that you perceive in modified states of consciousness, if you pay attention in your visions to these entities, they emit a vibration or a melody. And the main work of the shaman is to learn the melody of the different species. And once you have the melody of the species, you actually have everything you need about that species. So the essence of the essence is music. And this has nothing to do with entertainment and everything to do with knowledge. And shamans, the way that you estimate a shaman's knowledge is like so here, a university professor, how many books have you published? The shaman is, how many melodies do you know? So that's how central music is to understanding the world. And play and dance, you say?
Yeah, maybe there's sense of play, and then maybe how dance fits into the music thing or whatever.
Well, dance actually was... I was mainly with Shamanic people that I was living and have experience with, and dance was more festive than there are societies where dance is part of the ayahuasca ritual, but not with the Shamanic, and dance was just more about festivities and drinking manioc beer and making merry. And, play, I think, is an interesting subject of inquiry. I'm not so sure that it actually is an indigenous concept. If you say in your language, how do you say play? It would take looking into this. Children clearly mimic the adults, and so there is that notion of play. And they're also very good at just, look, that story I told about the old shaman, he was playing around with me. So they certainly like to, they're tricksters and stuff, but I'm not sure that is, we have these different categories. So like music is entertainment, and play is like, football in the garden and stuff like that. And so we have these clear-cut categories. In the Amazon, it's a little bit different. I'm not sure if that starts to answer your question.
The next question is on your left.
Hi. I guess this goes back to rational use of resources. You'd mentioned earlier that obviously taking such compounds as ayahuasca are very risky, psychologically, and certain people shouldn't take them. In your time there, had you noticed a selective use? For example, was there any differentiation between women, children, or the elderly, the dying, in a hospice? Was there a rational use of medication despite the lack of empirical evidence that somebody was, say, mentally ill or suffering from a mental disorder?
Well, that's a good question. And part of the answer, these people would say to their children, if you don't behave, we're going to give you datura. Or they had hallucinogens for their dogs, which is, this will turn it into a good hunter. I showed up at these people's house one day and they weren't around, but this dog was lying there. It looked like it was dying. It was, its pupils were like this. It was on the ground. It must have been bitten by a snake or something. No. It had just been, they were turning it into a good hunting dog. And it's true that after that, a few days later, this dog was much sharper and going into the forest and, yes, there is a contraindication that pregnant women should not take ayahuasca and that it precipitates miscarriages. So there's one. But actually, children, babies would be given a little bit. And, it was for the young and old, and you could use it to find out who'd stolen the chickens or who was causing harm in the village or who was sleeping with whose wife. And you could use it for if you have any kind of question, that's what you use ayahuasca for. Okay.
There's a common either conception or misconception about knowledge in our Western culture that the kind of highest use for it is improving the quality of life for everyone in terms of health and happiness, etc. And I wonder what your sense, living with the Amazonian people, I consider that, I think that, okay, that sounds like it would be mind-blowingly wonderful and wise, and you'd learn all these things, but I would be so uncomfortable. In terms of our sense of quality of life, the treatment of women, the treatment of children, the absence of disease, how do you find that this knowledge, which seems so readily available, has enhanced quality of life in a way that a Westerner would understand in terms of happiness, well-being? Is that a goal in either culture? You think of that as primitive, as non-advanced, and us as advanced, but I think you've experienced something very different that changes those concepts, and I wonder what that is.
Well, it's a slightly difficult question, and it would take quite a while to unpack it and answer it. Just what quality of life is and what well-being is. These are deep questions. But to put it briefly, first of all, in that neck of the woods, there's no hospitals, no doctors, no penicillin, no nothing, and this is what there is. So it may not be comfortable, and it may not be even understandable to us, but this is what they have, and this is what they work with. Meanwhile, if we're talking about ayahuasca, what it's called locally is the purge. la purga. And there, so, we think that vomiting and so forth is disagreeable. But in their view, there's nothing like cleaning out the system. It's good. It's like spring cleaning. And especially in this tropical environment, there's lots of stomach parasites. And so, the first thing is that it cleans you out. And so then you can experience it yourself. I've experienced it myself. And what is, in terms of well-being and health, ayahuasca has certainly made me aware of the importance of having a healthy body and a healthy diet, and thinking again about just what I put inside my body. And it first and foremost, before even manifesting the mind, it made me aware of my body. So it's a really body experience. And yes, I think it is possible for a person to use this and to enhance health of body and also health of mind. And in terms of the mind goes, I think ayahuasca is particularly useful to make you aware of your own presuppositions. And this is very useful as well. So it doesn't necessarily make you happier. It can make life a lot more complicated, but it certainly makes it more interesting. Okay, thank you very much.